The storekeeper read the supply list aloud to the men around his stove. Oakum, pine tar, rope, pulleys, stovepipe. He paused, and the store went quiet enough to hear the nails settling on the counter. She forgot the hymn book, he said, for when they bury her under the lake. From the road, the work looked exactly as foolish as it sounded. A widow hauling tar and rope across frozen ground, two children stacking stones in a crate, and an iron grain bin lying in the mud like a coffin no one had ordered. The widow did not answer. She heated the tar and kept working. The judgment had taken 4 minutes to read. Deputy Jonas Pearson folded the paper, slid it into his coat, and could not make himself look at the woman standing in the doorway. The half-finished claim shack behind her had one proper wall facing north, a second wall framed but open to wind through gaps in the green lumber, and a roof of canvas stretched over poles that sagged where rain had pooled and frozen. A stove sat in the center of the single room with no chimney pipe attached. Ash from a dead fire had blown across the plank floor and settled on a wool blanket where a boy of 6 lay coughing into the crook of his arm. Marit Vangen did not cry. She held the door frame with one hand and her daughter's shoulder with the other. Eli was 9 and gripped a cracked stove lid in both fists as though someone might try to take it. 3 months earlier, Marit's husband Oddmund had climbed a grain elevator scaffolding near the rail spur outside Devil's Lake. The scaffolding gave way. He fell 22 feet onto a concrete footing and died before a doctor reached the yard. The note on the quarter section he had been proving up passed to the man who held it, Rufus Klein, storekeeper, land speculator, and the only source of credit within 9 miles. Klein found a defect in the filing. He did not need the land. He needed Marit off it so the title cleared, and the county surveyor agreed. Marit was not given open prairie. She was given what no one else would take: 2 acres of frozen lake edge, a collapsed fish shed with half its boards rotted through, and the right to remove one abandoned iron grain bin shell from the elevator yard where Oddmund had died. She had $12.70, 1 oil lamp, 3 gallons of kerosene, a hand auger, 2 chisels, 1 brace, and a small crosscut saw, 2 wool blankets, and a patched buffalo robe, 1 sack of flour, 1 sack of potatoes, coffee, salt pork, and 2 children whose names were already written on the county poor officers list. If she failed to establish adequate shelter before the county reviewed her case in February, Eli would be sent to one family and burnt to another. She would lose them both. The fare back to Iowa for 3 was more than $30. She had no relatives closer than Decorah, and those relatives had written to say the house was full. She could not board with the nearest neighbor, Clara Mott, because Clara already kept 5 children and a mother-in-law in 2 rooms and had said so plainly. She could not remarry into shelter because the only offer, Klein's widowed cousin, required her to surrender the children's inheritance claim on the original quarter section, a claim that would matter if the filing defect was ever reversed. She could not walk away from the lake parcel because abandoning it meant abandoning the only legal address that kept the children listed as hers. Every door was nailed shut from the outside. Dr. Anson Bell arrived on the 3rd morning. He was 56, town physician, a man who had apprenticed in a Union Field hospital as a boy of 14 and never fully left the habit of counting supplies before counting patients. He walked the lake parcel with his cane, tapping the frozen ground as though testing a floor he did not trust. He counted aloud. Marit heard every number. "You have 1 wall that holds wind," Bell said. "A second wall that does not. No roof worth the word. Less than half a cord of split wood. 3 gallons of kerosene. 2 children, one of whom has a cough that will worsen before January." He stopped walking and faced her. "By February, you need 6 cords minimum, a tight stove with a proper draw, and neighbors closer than a mile. You have none of these things." Marit said she had the iron shell. Bell turned toward the rail spur where the grain bin cylinder lay on its side in frozen mud. 12 feet across, 15 feet high, riveted plates with a dent along one side where a crane load had struck it during the failed elevator project. The inside had been tarred after someone attempted a waterproofing experiment that went nowhere. It smelled of pitch and old standing water. "Iron conducts cold faster than wood," Bell said. "You could build a fire inside that thing and the walls would still freeze your hand. That shell will not keep heat. It will steal it." "I do not intend to keep heat the way you mean," Marit said. Bell studied her. He had seen winter pneumonia take children who slept in damp rooms. He had seen cabins where smoke pooled because the chimney would not draw. He had pulled a dead woman from a sod house whose roof collapsed under snow while she slept. He did not argue with Marit because he thought she was stupid. He argued because he had carried small bodies to the church and did not want to carry 2 more. "1 week," he said. "Find ordinary shelter, a room, a barn loft, a dugout with a stove. If you have not done so by next Wednesday, I will write the county poor officer myself. Not because I wish to, because the alternative is worse." He walked back toward town without looking at the iron shell again. Marit stood on the lake shore after he left. The ice was thick enough to walk on, but not thick enough to trust with weight beyond a single person. She knelt and scraped snow away with her bare hand until she could see through a cloudy pane of ice to black water moving underneath. Slow, patient, alive. Burnt had followed her. He crouched beside her and looked down. "Is the lake dead in winter?" he asked. "No," Marit said. "It is only covered." She did not yet have a plan. She had a question. And the question had no answer she could find in any wall, any stove, any structure anyone in Devil's Lake had ever built. Why was the water still moving? The idea did not arrive whole. It arrived the way most dangerous ideas arrive, one remembered fact at a time, each one ordinary, none of them ordinary together. Marit's father had been a cooper and icehouse worker in Decorah, Iowa. She had spent childhood summers inside the icehouse watching him stack lake-cut blocks in sawdust. Blocks cut in January lasted until July. The building was not heated. The building was not insulated in any way a carpenter would recognize. It simply held cold the way a jar holds water, by keeping the air from carrying it away. She remembered something else. Barrels of butter stored in the spring house sat in flowing water year-round. In summer, the water kept them cool. In winter, the water around the barrels never froze, even when the air above the spring turned bitter. Her father had pressed her palm against the outside of a barrel once, crouching beside her in the stone-walled room where the spring came through. She expected cold. She felt something closer to nothing, a neutral temperature that was neither the killing air outside nor the warmth of the kitchen. The stone was wet. The barrel staves smelled of pine tar. Yellow lamplight caught the surface of the water, and she could see her father's reflection bending beside her own. He tapped the barrel with his knuckle. "Listen," he said. "Do you hear how full it sounds? Water holds what air throws away. Remember that." She had not remembered it for 20 years. She remembered it now. She thought about that for 2 days while splitting the half-cord of wood Bell had counted. She thought about it while feeding burnt broth made from salt pork and potato water. She thought about it while lying awake under the buffalo robe listening to ice groan on the lake like a ship rolling in a harbor. On the 4th day, she borrowed a thermometer from Dr. Bell's back room. She told the housekeeper she needed to check whether her kerosene was too cold to burn properly, which was plausible enough to avoid questions. She took a fishing line from the collapsed shed, tied a horseshoe to the end for weight, and walked out onto the lake ice with Eli. She cut a hole with the hand auger, widening it with the cross-cut saw until she could lower the thermometer on the fishing line. The work took longer than she expected. The ice was nearly 10 inches thick at this distance from shore, and the saw bit through it in slow, grinding strokes that numbed her arms to the shoulder. Eli held the auger handle steady while Marit sawed. Chips of ice flew up and caught in the girl's hair. When the hole was wide enough, Marit tied the thermometer to the fishing line with a double knot and lowered it. Near the surface, the water numbed her fingers through her mittens in less than a minute. She lowered the line deeper. 5 feet. 10 feet. Eli counted the knots Merritt had tied at 1-foot intervals. At 14 feet, she pulled the thermometer up, wiped ice crystals from the glass with her skirt, and held it close to her face until the red line steadied. 39 degrees. The air above the lake was 6 degrees below zero that morning. The water 14 feet down was 39 above. A difference of 45 degrees, held in place by nothing more than the weight of water sitting on top of itself. The lake was not heated. The lake was insulated by its own depth, by the ice cap above, by the simple fact that water reaches its heaviest point near 39 degrees and sinks, forming a floor of warmth that the wind above could not reach. The surface killed. The depth held steady. Clara Mott found Marit still kneeling beside the hole that afternoon. Clara was 38, raw-boned, carrying a basket of frozen laundry she had beaten against a stump because her washboard had cracked. She had 5 children, a husband who had left for railroad work in Montana and sent money twice before going silent, and a mother-in-law who prayed audibly for his return every evening. Clara was not cruel. She was tired to the marrow. "You will freeze your knees through," Clara said, "and then Belle will have 3 patients instead of 2. Marit held up the thermometer. 39 degrees, 14 feet down. Clara stared at her. And the air's 6 below. I know what the air is. I live in it. Clara shifted the laundry basket. What does warm water under ice do for your children? If I could put a room down there, Marit said, the water would hold it at 39 degrees, day and night, storm or calm. The lake does not care what the wind does. Clara set the basket down. If water is warmer, why does it kill men who fall through? Because men are not sealed, Marit said. Because wet clothes steal heat faster than cold air. Because they cannot breathe under ice. And your children can? Marit did not answer immediately. She looked toward the rail spur where the iron shell lay like a discarded cannon barrel. 12 feet across, 15 feet high, tarred on the inside, riveted at the seams. If I lower that shell open end down into the lake, she said, it traps air inside, like turning a cup upside down in a basin. The air stays. The water presses against the outside, 39 degrees all winter. Clara's face changed, not to understanding, to fear. You want to put your children inside a grain bin at the bottom of a frozen lake. Not the bottom. The shell sits on anchor cribs, hatch above the ice. They climb down a ladder into trapped air. One lamp, and their own bodies warm it from 39 to 60 degrees, maybe higher. And if the seal breaks, they drown. And if the vent blocks, they suffocate. And if the ice shifts and the hatch jams, I clear it from outside. Clara picked up her laundry basket. Her hands were shaking, and not from the cold. A roof belongs above your head, she said, not under your feet. She walked away. She did not look back, but she did not go to Belle, and she did not go to Klein, and she did not tell anyone what Marit had said. That silence would matter later. Marit spent the evening scratching the design into the back of a flour sack with a piece of coal. She could see it now. Cut a square hole through lake ice near the deepest reachable shelf, roughly 21 feet from shore. Drag the riveted shell onto a timber cradle built from salvaged cottonwood beams. Seal the lower seams with oakum driven tight, covered in pine tar, reinforced with hammered lead washers under every suspect rivet head. Lower the shell open end downward like a diving bell, trapping air inside. Anchor it with 4 stone-filled timber cribs on the lakebed to keep it from shifting. Leave the upper hatch just above ice level as the entry point. Run a 2-inch vent pipe up through a wooden sleeve with a snow hood. Build an interior plank platform above the lower curve so bedding stays dry. Use one shielded oil lamp and body heat as the only heat sources. The risk calculation sat in her chest like a swallowed stone. If the oakum failed, the lake came in. If the vent clogged, the air went bad. If the anchor crib shifted, the shell tipped and the trapped air escaped upward through the ice hole. If any one of a dozen seams gave way under the slow, patient, relentless pressure of water 14 feet deep, her children would die in an iron room that no one could reach in time. But if she did nothing, the county would take them anyway. Belle's deadline was 6 days away. Winter would not wait for 6 days. She folded the flour sack and put it inside her coat. Rufus Klein heard about the thermometer before sundown. In a town the size of Devil's Lake in 1910, a widow borrowing a doctor's instrument and kneeling on the ice attracted notice the way smoke attracts eyes, not because anyone understood what it meant, but because it looked like trouble. By the next morning, Klein had the story assembled from 3 sources: the housekeeper who had lent the thermometer, a boy who had watched Marit cutting the ice hole, and Clara Mott's mother-in-law, who had overheard Clara muttering about grain bins and lake water while hanging laundry inside to dry. Klein held court at his store. The building was the largest in the commercial block. Dry goods, hardware, patent medicines, and a credit ledger that half the county owed money into. A cast-iron stove sat in the center of the floor. Men gathered around it in winter the way cattle gather around a salt block. Klein stood behind the counter with Marit's supply list in his hand. She had left it the day before, hoping to place an order on credit. Oakum, he read aloud. Pine tar, lamp glass, 50 feet of rope, 2 pulleys, stovepipe for a vent, nails. He paused. She forgot the hymn book for when they bury her under the lake. The men laughed. Not all of them, but enough. Widow Vangen has finally found a house cheap enough, Klein said. One that sinks. From the road, the work Marit had begun looked exactly as insane as Klein described. A woman hauling rope and tar across frozen ground toward the lake shore. 2 children picking stones from a snow-covered bank and piling them in a wooden crate. An iron cylinder lying on its side near the rail spur, patched with black tar like a boat no one intended to sail. Klein delayed her supplies. The freight wagon from Fargo, he said, was full. The oakum she needed was on back order. The rope had gone up 15 cents per foot now instead of 11, owing to what he called winter demand, though no one else in town had noticed demand change. He told the teamsters who hauled goods between the rail depot and the outlying farms that helping Marit move the iron shell could make them liable if the children died inside it. One teamster, a Swede named Lindgren, who had offered to lend his draft horse for the drag, came to Marit's camp with his hat in his hands and said he could not help. His wife had told him Klein would call the note on their wagon if he did. He left a coil of rope behind the fish shed and did not say where it came from. Klein told Dr. Bell that Marit had refused his advice and was now building what amounted to a sealed drowning chamber with county-registered dependents inside. And then he offered to buy the lake parcel. $5. Cash. Save everyone the trouble, he said, including the children. Marit walked into the store on the 5th day. Eli stood beside her. The girl's coat was too short at the wrists, and her boots had been resoled with a piece of harness leather. She held her mother's hand, but watched Klein the way a dog watches a boot. The store went quiet. 3 men stood near the stove. Klein's clerk sorted nails behind the counter. Through the back window, snow was falling in the kind of small, hard flakes that meant the temperature was dropping. A mother would build above ground, Klein said. Marit answered without raising her voice. A creditor would prefer I build nowhere. No one spoke. The stove ticked. A nail rolled off the counter and hit the floor. Klein's face did not change, but his hands moved behind the counter where Marit could not see them. He opened a drawer. He took out a sheet of paper. I will write the county poor officer myself, he said, by Friday. Marit took Eli's hand and walked out. The door closed behind her. The cold hit them both in the face like a hand. Snow had thickened while she was inside. The street was empty except for a dog standing in the lee of the livery, its ribs showing through a thin coat. "Can the county take us?" Eli asked. She had heard everything. She had stood beside her mother in that store and watched Klein speak as though the children were cargo to be rerouted. Marit looked at the lake, the vent pipe she had not yet built, the hatch that did not exist, the iron shell still lying in the mud a quarter-mile away. The distance between where she stood and where she needed to be felt less like a walk and more like a fall she had already started. "Not if I give them a warm place to stand," she said. She had 2 days before Klein's letter. She had 6 days before Bell's deadline. She had perhaps 6 weeks before the deep cold arrived, the kind that killed cattle standing up and froze pipes underground. She needed help, and the only help worth having would come from someone who understood seams. Toliff Asen appeared at dusk on the 6th day, walking from the direction of the rail depot with a canvas roll of tools over one shoulder and a cooper's mallet in his right hand. He was 61 years old. His coat was patched at both elbows. He coughed into a handkerchief that he pushed quickly back into his pocket, but Marit saw the color on it before it disappeared. He did not introduce himself with his name. He introduced himself with a question. "Where are the seams?" Marit had been heating tar over a small fire near the iron shell. Eli was asleep in the claim shack under the buffalo robe. Burnt sat on an overturned bucket, drawing in the frost on the shell's outer plate with his finger. "The seams are everywhere," Marit said. 27 that I can find." "You counted them already?" "I marked them with coal." Toliff set the canvas roll down and looked at the iron shell the way a doctor looks at a patient, not at the surface, but through it. He walked the full circumference. He ran his palm along the rivet lines. He stopped at the dent and pressed his thumb against the crease where the metal had folded. "Who are you?" Marit asked. "Toliff Asen, cooper, icehouse carpenter. I repaired railroad water tanks for 11 years until my lungs quit on me." He coughed again, shorter this time, controlled. "I heard in town that a woman was going to drown her children in a grain bin. I wanted to see the seams before I believed it." "And what do you see?" He ran his thumb along a rivet line near the bottom curve. "Rivets set by a man in a hurry. Half of them are flush. The other half are proud by 1/8 of an inch, which means the hammer missed the cup on the second strike. Proud rivets leak." He moved to the dent. "This crease is the worst. The metal folded but did not tear. That is good. A tear you cannot fix. A fold you brace and pack. I have no money to hire you. Then do not hire me." He crouched beside the shell and unwound the canvas roll. Inside were chisels of 4 different widths, a caulking iron, a small hammer, a tin of chalk dust, and a stub of beeswax. "Hold the lamp." Marit held the oil lamp close while Toliff tested the first rivet line. He dusted chalk along the seam, then lit a twist of oiled rag and held the smoke close to the joint. Where air leaked through from the inside, the smoke trembled and broke apart. Where the seam held, the chalk stayed dry and the smoke rose straight. "Mark the failures with coal," he said. "Not memory. Memory lies when you are tired." He made Eli count the marks the next morning. The girl walked the shell with a piece of chalk in each hand, calling numbers aloud. 27 seam leaks, 4 rivets that turned under finger pressure, 1 dent crease that Toliff said would fold inward under steady water pressure unless it was braced from inside with a timber knee. "This is not a grain bin anymore," Toliff said. "A grain bin holds dry weight pushing out. You need it to hold wet weight pushing in. Every force is backward. Can it hold? Toliff did not answer quickly. He pressed his ear against the iron and tapped the plate with the mallet. The sound rang clear on the good sections and went flat where the seam was loose. I have made barrels hold whiskey for 12 years, he said. Whiskey does not forgive a seam any more than a lake does. He stood up. His knees cracked. We start with the bottom. If the bottom holds, the sides will follow. If the bottom fails, nothing else matters. They began that evening. Toliff showed Marit how to drive oakum into a seam using the blunt chisel and short, even strokes. Never hard enough to spread the joint, only firm enough to pack the fiber tight against both faces of the iron. He showed her how to brush hot pine tar into the packed seam while the oakum was still compressed, so the tar wicked into the fibers instead of sitting on top. He showed her how to press narrow iron straps over the tarred seam and hammer them flat so the strap, the tar, and the oakum became a single layer that flexed with the metal instead of fighting it. Iron moves, he said. Cold iron shrinks, warm iron grows. If you seal it rigid, the seal cracks when the temperature changes. If you seal it soft, the seal breathes with the iron. Marit's palms split on the second night. The chisel handle was rough ash, and the cold made the skin brittle. She wrapped her hands in strips torn from a flour sack and kept working. Toliff watched her rewrap the cloth after it soaked through with blood and tar. You do not ask whether this is respectable, he said. No. Good. Respectable people freeze in respectable houses. By the end of the first week, they had sealed the lower third of the shell. Toliff tested each section with chalk and smoke. 11 seams passed. 3 needed rework. The dent crease took a full day. Toliff braced it from inside with a cottonwood knee cut from a branch Marit dragged off the lake shore, then packed the crease with double oakum and a lead washer hammered flat under the rivet head. The setback came on the 8th morning. Marit arrived at the shell to find a pool of black tar frozen on the ground beneath the seam she had finished the night before. Sometime in the dark, the temperature had dropped hard enough to shrink the iron plates apart at a joint she had sealed with single oakum. The tar had cracked cleanly like a pane of glass and pulled away from both faces. The seam was open again. 3 hours of work frozen out in a single night. Toliff examined the failure without speaking. He scraped the old tar away with a chisel and showed Marit what had happened. The oakum had been packed too shallow. It filled the outer half of the joint but left the inner half empty. When the iron shrank, the shallow packing had no grip. How deep? Marit asked. 3/8 of an inch. You need 5/8 minimum for a seam this wide. She had been measuring by feel, not by the chisel width. Toliff made her cut a gauge mark into the chisel handle, a notch at 5/8 that she could feel with her thumb in the dark. Every seam you finished yesterday, he said, test again tonight. The ones that cracked, you will know. The ones that held, mark with chalk so you do not waste time on them twice. She tested 14 seams that evening. 3 had cracked. She repacked all 3 with deeper oakum, double tar, and a lead strip pressed flat. Toliff watched but did not touch the tools. She had to learn the depth in her own hands. Burnt fell asleep beside the tar pot each night. Eli boiled coffee that was half water and brought it to them in a tin cup that burned their fingers. The temperature dropped 3 degrees each day. Snow came twice, light and dry, the kind that blew sideways and found every gap in clothing. The upper seams remained. The hatch was not yet cut. The anchor cribs were not built. The vent pipe did not exist. The block and tackle for lowering the shell had not been rigged, and Bell's deadline was 4 days away. Marit stood outside the claim shack at midnight, arms aching, tar under her fingernails and watched the stars. The lake groaned beneath its ice. The iron shell sat on its side, half sealed, waiting. Somewhere in town, Klein's letter was already written. Somewhere in Belle's office, a form waited for the names of 2 children. She could not see the end of the work from where she stood. She could only see the next seam. If you have ever been doubted by someone who did not understand what you were building, tell us in the comments, because Marit was about to learn that doubt can either break a person or sharpen them. The next morning, Toliff arrived before dawn. He was carrying a coil of rope over his shoulder and dragging a wooden block the size of a man's head, a ship's pulley he had taken from a salvage pile behind the depot warehouse. "Where did you get that?" Marit asked. "I asked a man who owed me a favor from 1906. He dropped the rope. We need 3 more, and 20 feet of pole for the derrick legs, and someone with a horse who does not work for Klein." "There is no one with a horse who does not work for Klein." Toliff smiled. It was the first time she had seen him smile. "Then we need a horse who does not know it works for Klein." He looked at the sealed seams, then at the sky, then at the lake. "How deep is your shelf?" he asked. 14 feet where I measured, maybe deeper at 21 feet from shore." "Good! We lower it there. The deeper the water, the steadier the temperature. But we need the ice hole cut before the next hard freeze, or we will be chopping through 2 feet instead of 1. The clock was running. The oakum was half gone. Belle's deadline was 3 days out. Klein's letter was already on its way, and the shell still lay on its side in frozen mud, half sealed, unhung, and unproven. But inside the sealed sections, when Toliff pressed his ear to the iron and tapped, the sound came back clean and tight. No flat spots, no dead seams. "Will it hold?" Marit asked again. This time Toliff answered. "The seams will hold," he said. "The question is whether you will." The horse belonged to a man named Lindgren, the same Swede whose wife had forbidden him from helping. Toliff did not ask to borrow the horse. He asked to borrow the harness. The horse, he said, would follow the harness on its own if someone walked in front with a grain bucket. This was not exactly true, but by the time Lindgren figured that out, the horse was already standing on the lake shore beside the iron shell, and Lindgren's oldest boy was holding the bucket with a look on his face that said he had been told not to come and had come anyway. They built the skid first. 4 cottonwood beams, each 12 feet long, stripped of bark and notched at the ends, so they locked together into a frame. Toliff showed Marit how to grease the underside with tallow, so the skid would slide across the frozen ground without catching. The shell weighed more than Marit could calculate. Toliff guessed 1,400 pounds based on the plate thickness and the number of rivets, and the only way to move it was slowly. They wrapped rope slings around the cylinder at 3 points, rocked it onto the skid with a pry bar made from a rail tie, and hitched the harness to the front beam. The horse pulled. The skid moved 6 inches and stopped. The frozen mud held the tallow-greased runners like a jaw. Toliff said nothing. He walked to the front of the skid, knelt, and packed loose snow under the leading edge to form a ramp. He motioned for the boy to lead the horse again. This time the skid climbed the snow ramp and broke free. It slid forward a foot, then 2, then began to move with the heavy, reluctant rhythm of something too large for the force behind it. They dragged the shell across 400 yards of frozen ground in 3 hours. Marit walked beside it with her hand on the iron, feeling the rivets pass under her palm, counting the sealed seams and the ones still open. Eli walked ahead of the horse, picking stones out of the path. Bernd sat on the skid with his legs dangling, riding the iron shell like a boat on dry land. When they reached the lake shore, Toliff stopped the horse and stood looking at the ice. "We cut the hole here," he said. He pointed with the mallet at a spot 21 feet from the bank, where the water, according to Marit's fishing line measurements, was deepest. 14 by 14, big enough to lower the shell through with clearance on every side. If we cut too small, the shell catches on the lip and we lose it. Cutting the ice took 2 days. Marit and Toliff worked with the crosscut saw, Eli clearing ice chips, Lindgren's boy hauling cut blocks away from the edge. The ice was 11 inches thick. Each cut through a spray of white chips that froze in their eyebrows and on their collars. Marit's shoulders burned by the second hour. By the 6th hour, her arms moved by memory alone, because the muscles had stopped reporting anything except a dull, constant ache. Toliff could not saw for long stretches. His lungs caught after 10 minutes of heavy breathing, and he would step back, cough into the handkerchief, and return to marking the cut line with chalk while Marit finished the stroke. She did not comment on the blood she sometimes saw on the cloth. He did not hide it as carefully as he thought. On the second evening of cutting, the last block broke free, and the black water of the lake opened beneath them like a mouth. Steam rose from the hole in the sub-zero air. The water moved, slow, dark, patient. Marit lowered the thermometer again, 38 degrees at depth, 1 degree cooler than her first measurement, still 38 degrees warmer than the air pressing down on it. The derrick took another day. 3 poles of 20 feet each, lashed at the top to form a tripod, set on timber pads so the legs would not punch through the ice. Toliff rigged the block and tackle through the apex, 2 pulleys at the top, 1 at the base, with the rope running through all 3 so that each pull on the free end lifted 1/3 the shell's weight. Even so, the pull was enormous. They hitched the free end to the horse capstan, a vertical post sunk into the bank with a crossbar. The horse walked circles around, winding the rope. Before they could lower the shell, the anchor cribs had to go down first. Toliff built 4 timber frames, each 3 feet square, from scrap lumber and cottonwood. Marit and Eli filled them with lake stones pulled from the shallows where the bank had eroded, and 3 pieces of scrap rail iron that Toliff had pried from an abandoned spur. Each crib weighed close to 300 pounds when loaded. They lowered them one at a time through the ice hole on rope slings, spacing them in a square pattern on the lakebed so the shell would sit centered between them, with anchor lines running from its sides to the cribs. The 3rd crib dropped too fast. The rope burned through Marit's hands before she could break it, and the crib punched through a thin spot in the lower ice shelf, with a sound like a heavy door slamming. Water surged upward through the hole. Eli, who had been standing at the edge holding a guide rope, stumbled backward as the ice cracked beneath her right foot. The crack ran 2 feet before stopping. Marit grabbed Eli's coat and pulled her back. The girl did not scream. She looked down at the crack and then at her mother and said, "The ice is thinner there." "Yes." "We should mark it." Toliff marked it with a coal line. He did not say what Marit was already thinking, that the crib had fallen through to a deeper shelf, which meant the lakebed was uneven, which meant the shell might not sit level. An unlevel shell would trap less air on one side and more on the other. It would stress the anchor lines unevenly. It could tip. They could not retrieve the crib. They built a 5th one and lowered it more carefully, with Toliff controlling the brake and Marit feeding the rope through the block. This time it settled on firm bottom, 4 cribs in place. The shell could descend. Bell returned on the morning of the lowering. He did not announce himself. He stood on the bank with his cane and watched as Marit and Toliff rigged the final slings. The iron shell hung from the derrick now, swaying slightly in the wind, its open bottom facing the black water below. The sealed seams gleamed with tar. The dent crease was braced and strapped. The upper hatch, a square opening Toliff had cut with a cold chisel and reinforced with an iron frame, gaped at the sky. You're making the grave wider, Bell said. Toliff answered before Marit could. Graves do not need vents. Bell looked at the vent pipe lying on the bank. 2 inches of stovepipe with a wooden sleeve at the base and a sheet iron hood at the top, angled to keep snow from falling straight in. It was the simplest piece of the entire structure, and it was the one that would matter most. Air inside that thing will sour within hours, Bell said. 3 people breathing, 1 lamp burning. You will have carbon smoke building before midnight. Then I need to know the numbers, Marit said. How many cubic feet of air inside the shell? Bell blinked. He had not expected mathematics. He looked at the shell hanging from the derrick, its 12-foot width and 15-foot height forming a rough cylinder. Roughly 1,700 cubic feet, he said, assuming you lose the lower curve to the platform. 3 people breathing and 1 lamp, Toliff said. How many hours before the air needs replacing? Bell calculated. Marit watched his lips move. He was a man who had studied air in hospital wards where ventilation meant the difference between recovery and infection. He knew the numbers better than anyone in Devil's Lake. With the vent drawing properly, you can sustain 3 people and 1 lamp indefinitely, he said. The draft carries bad air up and pulls fresh air in through the hatch gaps. But if the vent clogs, snow, ice, a bird, anything, you have roughly 4 hours before headache sets in, 8 before confusion, 12 before serious danger. Then the vent must not clog, Marit said. That is not engineering, Bell said. That is prayer. He walked away. But he did not write the county that week. Something in the numbers had changed his calculation, not about the shelter, but about the woman building it. A person who asked about cubic feet and vent draw was not the same as a person drowning children in a grain bin. She might still be wrong, but she was not reckless. They lowered the shell at dawn on a Thursday. The wind had died. The lake surface was still. Frost clung to the derrick ropes and to Marit's eyelashes as she watched the iron cylinder descend through the ice hole inch by inch, the horse walking slow circles around the capstan while Toliff fed rope and called instructions. The shell touched water and stopped sinking. The trapped air inside resisted. Water pressed against the lower opening but could not enter because the air had nowhere to go. This was the principle, the diving bell, the inverted cup, the sealed vessel that physics would not flood as long as the seal held and the opening stayed submerged. Toliff increased the load. He added Marit's weight to the capstan arm, then his own. The shell sank deeper. Water rose against the outside. The tar-sealed seams disappeared below the surface one by one. Marit counted them as they went under. 12 seams on the first ring, 8 on the second. The dent crease vanished last, and she held her breath as the water covered it. No bubbles. The shell continued down. The anchor lines went taut. The upper hatch settled 6 inches above the ice surface, high enough to keep water from sloshing in, low enough that a person could climb down from the ice without a tall ladder. Toliff tied off the capstan and walked to the edge of the hole. He lay flat on the ice and put his ear to the water. Quiet, he said. Is that good? Quiet means the air is still inside. If it were leaking, you would hear bubbles clicking against the underside of the ice. They installed the vent pipe through its wooden sleeve, sealed the base with tar, and fitted the snow hood. The wind picked up as they worked. The hood turned on its collar, pointing away from the wind like a weather vane. Toliff watched it turn and nodded. Draft will draw when the hood faces downwind, he said. The wind passing over the opening creates suction that pulls bad air up and out. For one long moment after the pipe was set, no one heard anything. Toliff pressed his ear to the metal again. Then from inside the pipe came a low whistle, air moving through a narrow space drawn by the wind above. Air is still there, Toliff said. But the whistle changed pitch, higher, then lower, then higher again, unsteady, like breath through a throat that was not fully open. What does that mean? Marit asked. Toliff stood up slowly. He brushed ice from his coat. It means the vent draws, but not evenly. The sleeve joint may be too tight, or there's a burr inside the pipe. We need to check it. Can we check it from above? No, from inside. The shell had to be entered. Someone had to climb down through the hatch, drop onto the platform that did not yet exist, and listen to the pipe from the inside while the lake pressed against every sealed seam from the outside. Toliff looked at Marit. Marit looked at the hatch. Not yet, she said. I build the platform first. Then I go down. The interior platform took 3 more days. Marit cut planks from the remains of the fish shed and handed them down through the hatch to Toliff, who stood on a rope-slung board and nailed them across the lower curve of the shell. The platform sat 3 feet above the bottom, creating a dry floor above the curve where any leaked water would collect. She built a shelf for matches and a lamp. She drove iron hooks into the rivet heads for hanging rope, tools, and the bell cord Toliff insisted on. The bell cord ran from a hook inside the hatch up to a small sleigh bell mounted on a post above the ice. If the vent clogged and the hatch jammed, anyone inside could pull the cord and ring until someone on the surface heard. It was the last line of defense. It assumed someone would be close enough to hear. Marit asked Toliff, "And if no one comes?" "Then you clear it yourself." She went in alone on a Tuesday afternoon. The children stayed on the bank with Toliff. Marit climbed through the hatch and descended the rope ladder with a lamp in one hand, a wool blanket over her shoulder, a piece of chalk, and Eli's school watch. The interior was strange. The iron walls sweated, condensation from warm, moist air meeting cold metal. The water outside made a sound she had not expected, a slow, rhythmic tapping, as though the lake were pressing its fingers against the shell, testing it, patient and curious. The lamp flame bent toward the vent pipe, drawn by the draft. When she held her hand near the base of the pipe, she could feel air moving, cool air entering through the hatch gaps, warming as it mixed with her breath and the lamp's heat, rising toward the vent and escaping. She sat on the platform and opened the watch. Outside air when she descended, 14 below zero. Inside the shell before the lamp, 41 degrees. The water's gift, 39 degrees of baseline, plus 2 from the trapped air absorbing the day's residual warmth through the iron. After 1 hour with the lamp burning, 56 degrees. The small flame in her own body had added 15 degrees to a sealed iron room surrounded by water. After 3 hours, 64 degrees near the platform. Warmer at head height where the heated air pooled. Cooler near the hatch where drafts entered. Moisture collected on the walls and ran down in thin streams to a gutter channel Toliff had hammered from a strip of scrap tin. The gutter carried the water to the lowest point of the platform where it dripped through a gap into the dead space below. No puddles on the sleeping surface, no dripping onto bedding. She stayed for 5 hours. She ate nothing. She listened to the lake. She listened to the iron. She listened to the vent. The whistle had steadied. Toliff had cleared a small burr from the pipe with a file, and the draft now drew evenly. The flame stood still. When she climbed out, the cold hit her like a wall. Her skin, which had adjusted to 64 degrees, registered 14 below as a physical assault. She understood immediately why men who fell through lake ice died, not because the water was warm, but because the gap between their body's expectation and the water's reality was so vast that the body shut down trying to close it. Toliff was waiting beside the hatch. He read her face before she spoke. It holds, she said. How warm. 64 after 3 hours. 1 lamp. Toliff said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Your father's barrels held butter. Yours will hold children." Belle said the numbers proved nothing until a storm pressed snow over the vent. Rufus said she had built a parlor for fish. Clara asked whether the children could sleep without hearing the lake move against the iron. Toliff gave Marit the last lesson that mattered. They stood beside the vent pipe as the sun dropped and the sky turned the color of a bruise. "Tie the bell cord tight," he said. "Test the vent every 4 hours if the wind rises. Do not trust the flame. By the time the flame tells you the air is bad, the air has been bad for an hour. Trust your eyes. If the soot on the lamp glass thickens faster than usual, the vent is slowing. If it thickens and you feel a headache starting behind your eyes, the vent is nearly closed. And if it closes entirely, you open the hatch and climb out, even in a storm. Bad air kills faster than cold air. You have 12 hours at worst. You have 4 hours before the headache makes you stupid. Do not wait for stupid." The sky was changing. Not the gradual darkening of a normal evening, but a thickening, as though the air itself were filling with something heavier than wind. Marit had seen skies like this in Iowa before bad storms, the light going flat, the horizon disappearing, the birds going silent hours before the first gust. A telegraph message reached town that afternoon. The operator at the depot read it to Klein, who read it to the men at the store stove. Severe cold moving south from Manitoba. Rail delays expected. Stock warning issued for all exposed livestock. Klein smirked when he heard where Marit's children would be sleeping. "Now we find out what kind of house sinks first," he said. The blizzard did not arrive the way storms arrive in stories. All at once, a single dramatic curtain. It arrived in layers, each one worse than the last, each one making the previous layer seem mild by comparison. The wind came first. It crossed the open prairie from the northwest and hit Devil's Lake with nothing between it and the Canadian border to slow it down. The lake ice groaned under the pressure. Snow that had been lying on the surface for weeks lifted and flew horizontal, cutting visibility to the length of a wagon. Then the temperature fell, not gradually. It fell the way a stone falls, straight down, fast, and without warning. By dusk, the thermometer outside Klein's store read 18 below. By midnight, it would pass 30. By dawn, it would reach a number Belle had not seen since the winter of 1896. Marit moved the children into the submerged shelter at dusk, before the worst of the wind arrived. She carried 2 blankets, 3 jars of water, 1 loaf of bread, salt pork wrapped in cloth, the kerosene lamp, matches in wax paper, the bell cord, a small axe, and Toliff's chalk bag. She made Eli carry the watch. She made Bernd carry the sealed jar of matches. They climbed down through the hatch, one at a time. Marit went last. She pulled the hatch cover into place, not sealed, because the hatch gaps were part of the ventilation system, but weighted with a flat stone to keep the wind from tearing it off. Inside, the lamp was already burning. The temperature read 42 degrees. By the time all 3 of them were settled on the platform, their body heat would push it higher. The vent whistled softly. The walls tapped. Bernd cried. Not loudly. The sound came from deep in his chest, the kind of crying that happens when a child is frightened of something too large to name. The walls made the lake sound alive. Water moved against iron in patterns that were almost rhythmic, almost like breathing, but not quite. The not quite was what frightened him. Eli put her arm around her brother. She was 9 years old and doing the work of someone twice her age without being asked. She said, "It is just the water talking." What is it saying? Bernd asked. Marit answered from across the platform, where she was adjusting the lamp wick. It is saying it will not let us freeze. The first hour passed. The temperature inside rose to 58 degrees. The wind above screamed across the ice, and they could hear it through the vent pipe, a high, constant shriek that made the pipe vibrate. But the sound was above them. The cold was above them. The killing force of the blizzard existed in a world they had left behind when they climbed down the ladder. The second hour brought the first complication. Eli's forehead was hot, not warm from the shelter, hot from a fever that had been building for 2 days while Marit was too busy with construction to notice. The girl's cheeks were flushed, and her eyes had the glassy brightness that Marit recognized from childhood sick rooms. She needed cool cloths and rest and clean air and a doctor. The doctor was in town, a mile away, and the storm between them might as well have been an ocean. The third hour brought the second complication. The lamp flame shrank. Marit saw it before she felt it. The flame, which had been burning steady and upright for 2 hours, began to lean sideways, then pull inward, then shrink to a blue nub at the base of the wick. The soot on the glass chimney thickened, not slowly. In minutes, a brown film coated the inside of the glass. Toliff's lesson. The vent is slowing. She checked the draft with her hand near the pipe base. Air was still moving, but weakly, a thin thread instead of a steady draw. The wind above had packed snow around the hood. The pipe was choking. If you are invested in the story, subscribe and stay with us, because what happened in the next few minutes decided whether the lake was shelter or a sealed iron trap. Marit tied a rope around her waist and knotted the other end to the hatch frame. She told Eli to hold the bell cord. She told Bernd to stay on the platform. She opened the hatch and climbed into the storm. The wind tore the breath from her mouth before she could take a full one. The cold was not a temperature, it was a force. It pressed against her face and chest as though trying to push her back down through the hatch. Snow flew so thick and fast that she could not see the vent pipe, which was 4 feet from the hatch. She followed the bell cord by touch. Her mittens had frozen to the hatch frame when she gripped it, and she had to tear them free, leaving wool fibers on the iron. The cord led her to the base of the vent pipe. She reached up and felt the snow hood. It was packed solid. Snow had been driven into the opening by the wind and frozen there in a mass the size of a loaf of bread. She struck it with the axe handle. The frozen mass cracked but did not fall. She struck again. A chunk broke away. But the pipe itself, the inside, where warm breath from below had met the freezing air at the rim, was iced over. A ring of ice had formed inside the pipe, narrowing the opening to less than an inch. She remembered Toliff's warning, never strike a frozen pipe hard from the side. A sharp blow on cold iron could crack the weld at the sleeve joint and split the pipe. If the pipe split, they lost the vent entirely. She pulled off her remaining mitten and pressed her bare hand against the pipe. The cold seared her skin. She breathed into her cupped hand and pressed it against the ice ring, trying to melt it with body heat. The ice gave nothing. Her fingers went white. She poured a thimble of kerosene from the lamp reserve onto a strip of cloth torn from her skirt hem. She lit it with a match from the waxed packet. The flame was tiny, and the wind nearly killed it before she could cup it against the pipe. She held the burning cloth inside the opening, low enough that the heat reached the ice ring, but high enough that the flame would not draw down the pipe into the shelter below. The ice melted in thin streams that ran down the inside of the pipe. 1 inch opened, then 2. She heard the whistle return, faint, then stronger, then steady. From below, inside the shelter, Eli had begun ringing the bell. The sound cut through the wind in sharp, desperate pulses. Marit could not go back down yet. The vent had to draw fully before she sealed herself inside again. She held the pipe steady with both hands, her bare fingers frozen to the metal, and waited. Burnt had gone quiet below. That was what had made Eli ring the bell. Not the air, the silence of her brother. The world beyond the hatch was dying, not figuratively. The storm was killing the town piece by piece. Clara Mott's cabin lost its stovepipe draft when ice formed inside the chimney cap. Smoke backed into the 2 rooms and filled them from ceiling to floor. Clara wrapped her 5 children in blankets and opened the door to clear the smoke, and the cold rushed in and undid an hour of stove heat in 30 seconds. Her youngest, Nell, who was 4, stopped feeling her fingers. Clara wrapped the child's hands in wool, and then in her own skirt, and then in a flour sack, and still the girl whimpered that her hands were gone. Clara looked out the door and saw nothing. The storm was a white wall in every direction. She could not see the barn, which was 40 feet away. She could not see the road. She could not see the ground beneath her boots. But she could see one thing. A quarter-mile away, above the lake, a small dark line rose above the white Maritz vent pipe, barely visible, the only vertical mark in a world the storm had erased. It stood because it was anchored to something below the ice, below the wind, below the killing air. Clara wrapped Nell against her chest and started walking toward it. On a farm between town and the lake, Peter Solheim tried to reach his cattle. He made it as far as the barn door. The wind knocked him sideways. He fell. The snow covered him while he was still trying to stand. His lantern lay beside him, still burning under a thickening blanket of white, its flame visible for 10 minutes before the glass cracked and went dark. Belle found him the next morning. The snow had been kind enough to let him die facing the barn. It had not been kind enough to let him reach it. Belle reached the lake after Clara. He had left town on foot with a scarf wrapped around his face and his medical bag pressed against his chest, walking by compass bearing because the road had disappeared. He heard the bell first, the small sleigh bell ringing in short, frantic bursts. Then he saw Clara kneeling beside the hatch, trying to open it while holding Nell with one arm. Marit was still on the ice. Her hands were frozen around the vent pipe. Her face was white. Her eyelashes were crusted shut with ice. She had been outside for nearly 20 minutes in conditions that killed Peter Solheim in less than 10. The vent pipe was clear. The whistle was steady. She had not let go because she did not trust the vent to stay clear if she stopped holding it. Belle pried her hands from the pipe. She screamed when the frozen skin tore. He pushed her toward the hatch. "Get inside," he said. "The vent. I will hold the pipe. Get inside." For the first time since she had begun this work, Marit obeyed someone else's instruction. She climbed through the hatch and dropped onto the platform. The warmth hit her like a blanket thrown over her head. Her hands began to burn as blood returned to the fingers. The lamp flame had risen. The vent was drawing again. The soot on the glass was lighter. The air tasted clean. Burnt was lying on the platform with his eyes closed. He was breathing. Eli had pulled both blankets over him and was sitting beside him with the bell cord still wrapped around her wrist. Belle helped Clara through the hatch. Then Nell. Then he came down himself. A 56-year-old man climbing a rope ladder into an iron room under a frozen lake while the worst blizzard in 15 years tried to erase the world above. He stood on the platform and looked around. The lamp burned steady. The walls were wet with condensation, but not dripping onto the platform. The gutter caught the moisture and carried it away. The air moved, a gentle circulation from hatch to vent. The temperature, when he found Marit's thermometer hung on a nail, read 61 degrees. Outside, the storm screamed past at 38 below. Belle examined Eli by lamplight. Fever, but not the dangerous kind. the kind that broke with rest and warmth. He examined Nell's fingers. They were red and painful, and the girl cried when he touched them, which was good. Feeling meant the flesh was alive. Frostbite that did not hurt was the frostbite that took fingers. His hands shook as he worked, not from cold. He had warmed quickly inside the shelter. They shook from something else. "This is warmer than my surgery," he said. No one answered. Marit was wrapping her torn hands in strips of blanket. Clara was rocking Nell. Eli was lying beside Barrett with the watch in her fist, still counting hours. The crisis did not end with warmth. It continued through the night. At 2 a.m, the ice groaned, a deep structural sound that vibrated through the iron walls and into the platform planks. One anchor line snapped with a report like a rifle shot. The shell shifted 2 inches to the east. Water slapped higher against the lower rim of the platform. Bell lunged for the hatch ladder. "We need to get out," he said. "Out is 38 below with no visibility," Marit said. "Out is where Peter Solheim is lying in the snow." "The structure is failing." "One anchor line. There are 3 more. The shell is shifting, not sinking." Toliff had reached the lake despite his lungs. He had come across the ice on his hands and knees, following the bell cord from the post he had driven at the shore. He pressed his ear against the outside of the shell, the way he had done when testing seams, and tapped. The sound came through the iron to Marit's ear inside. She tapped back. 3 times. Their signal. He tapped a pattern she had to think about. East crib. Moved. Then a pause. Then a single tap. Holding. The east anchor crib had shifted on the lakebed, probably pulled by the same force that snapped the line, but the remaining 3 cribs held. The shell was off-center by 2 inches, but stable. They could not fix it until the storm broke. Marit ordered everyone to shift weight to the west side of the platform to counterbalance the tilt. Bell argued. Clara obeyed without speaking. Nell had fallen asleep in her arms, the child's damaged fingers wrapped in cloth inside Clara's coat. Morning came gray and slow. The wind had not stopped, but it had lost its scream. The temperature outside still read 34 below. The temperature inside still read 62. The lamp had burned all night on less than 1 quart of kerosene. The vent still drew. The walls still held. Marit opened the hatch and looked out at a world erased. The snow had buried everything. The claim shack was invisible. The shore was invisible. The only marks on the surface were the vent pipe, the hatch, and a trail of kicked-up snow where Toliff had crawled to reach them. Toliff was sitting beside the hatch opening with his back against the pipe. His coat was white. His face was gray. He looked at Marit and smiled the same small smile he had given her when she found the horse. "Air is still there," he said. The vent pipe stood black against white ice. The hood turned slowly in the dying wind. Beneath it, the iron held. The lake held. The seams held. But the town had not yet counted its dead, and the shelter had not yet been named what it was. The storm broke on the 2nd day. The wind did not stop so much as exhaust itself, dropping from a scream to a mutter to a silence that felt louder than the noise it replaced. The sun came through a thin place in the clouds and turned the snow into a field of light so bright it hurt to look at. Marit climbed out of the hatch and stood on the ice. Clara followed with Nell asleep against her shoulder. Bell came last, moving slowly, his medical bag in one hand and the rope ladder in the other. He stood on the surface and looked toward town. Nothing moved. The rooftops that were visible had snow banked to the eaves. Smoke rose from 2 chimneys out of the dozen he could count. The rest were dark. A tree that had stood near the schoolhouse had split down the center from the cold, its heartwood exposed and pale against the white. Toliff was gone. His tracks led back toward the shore, filled in by the last hours of snow, but still visible as shallow dents in the surface. He had crawled back sometime in the night, alone, without telling anyone, without asking for help. Marit looked at the tracks and felt something she would not have been able to name, not anger, not gratitude, but the particular weight of knowing that a man had spent the worst night of the year on his knees in the snow because he cared more about the seams than about himself. There was no time for relief. Relief was a luxury the dead could not afford and the living could not use. Marit recorded the numbers that morning. She used the back of a flour sack and a piece of coal because her notebook was still in the claim shack under a foot of snow. Outside morning temperature, 38 degrees below zero. Inside the shelter near the platform, 68 degrees. Lamp fuel consumed overnight, less than 1 quart of kerosene. Water jars on the shelf, unfrozen. The glass was cool to the touch, but the water inside moved when she tilted the jar. Eli's fever reduced. The girl had slept 9 hours in steady warmth and woken asking for bread. Her color was better. Her forehead was warm but not hot. Nell's fingers, painful, swollen, but pink. Feeling had returned fully during the night. Belle had checked them twice by lamplight, and the second time the girl had pulled her hands away and said it hurt, which meant the nerves were alive and the flesh had not died. Belle repeated every measurement himself. He wiped the thermometer with his sleeve, held it at arm's length, waited for the mercury to settle, and read it twice. He touched the iron wall with his bare palm and held it there for 10 seconds. He stepped outside and stood in the 38 below air until his mustache froze and his eyes watered. He came back down the ladder. 68 degrees, he said, as though hearing the number for the first time. 1 lamp. 1 lamp, Marit confirmed, and 3 bodies. 3 bodies, which will not always be here. On an empty night with 1 lamp and no people, the temperature holds above 50. Belle sat on the edge of the platform. He was quiet for a long time. The lake tapped the walls. The vent whistled. The lamp burned steady. I was wrong about the lake, he said. Marit did not answer. She was wrapping her torn hands in fresh cloth. The skin had split again during the night when she gripped the rope ladder. I was right about bad air, Belle continued. The danger of a sealed space with insufficient ventilation is real. You nearly died clearing that vent. I did clear it. Because you knew what to look for. Because someone taught you to read the soot and feel the draft. He paused. I was wrong about the lake. I was right about the air. You were right to build a way for it to leave. Marit handed him the flour sack with the numbers. Write them clearly, she said. People trust your hand more than mine. Belle took the coal and copied the figures in the careful script he used for medical records. Outside temperature, inside temperature, fuel consumed, duration, number of occupants, condition of occupants upon exit. He wrote as though compiling a case study, which, in a way, he was. Word of the shelter reached town before Belle did. The story traveled the way all stories travel in a small community after a disaster, through the people who needed to tell it most. Clara told her mother-in-law, who told the woman at the well, who told the blacksmith's wife, who told everyone who came in to warm their hands at the forge. By the time Belle walked into Klein's store that afternoon, the version circulating had already acquired embellishments. The shelter was 30 feet deep. It was heated by the lake itself. It could hold 20 people, but the core was accurate enough. Marit Vangen's iron room under the ice had held 68 degrees while the world above tried to kill everything in it. Klein stood behind his counter. The store was crowded. Men who had spent 2 days digging out livestock and patching stovepipes stood around the stove with their coats open and their faces raw from wind. The blizzard had cost the town 4 horses, 60 head of cattle, a grain shed, and Peder Solheim. His body had been brought in that morning, frozen in the posture of a man reaching for a door handle. "The widow got lucky," Klein said. "The storm missed the lake." Bell answered from the doorway. He had not removed his coat. He did not move toward the stove. His medical bag hung at his side, and his face carried the expression of a man who had spent 2 days treating frostbite and writing death reports, and was not in the mood for performance. Luck does not hold a thermometer at 68 degrees. The store went quiet. Klein's hands moved below the counter. Bell walked to the center of the room and held up the flour sack with Marit's numbers written in his own hand. 38 below outside, 68 above inside. 1 quart of kerosene burned through the night. 2 children and 2 adults sheltered in a structure that stayed warmer than any cabin in this town, including mine, including the store, including the church. Nell Mott's fingers are still on her hands this morning because that iron room held warmth the way nothing above ground could. "She got lucky," Klein said again. His voice had shifted. The amusement that had flavored his mockery for weeks was gone. What replaced it was harder to name. Not fear exactly, but the sound of a man who had bet against something and was watching the odds move. "She got mathematics," Bell said. Water at 39 degrees does not vary with wind speed. It does not care whether the storm lasts 1 night or 10. The heat source is the lake itself, and the lake does not run out of fuel. He laid the flour sack on the counter and walked out. The men around the stove said nothing, but 3 of them came to the lake that week, then 2 more the week after. They came with questions, and they came without telling Klein they were going. Clara Mott came first. She arrived the morning after Bell's display at the store, carrying a jug of milk that had frozen solid in her kitchen, and a look on her face that sat somewhere between shame and determination. "Teach me," she said. Marit was on the ice beside the hatch, inspecting the vent pipe for damage from the storm. The hood had bent slightly. 1 anchor line was still broken. The shell was still 2 inches off center from the crib shift. There was work to do before the next storm, and there was no money to do it with. "Teach you what?" Marit asked. "How to keep a vent from choking. How to test whether my air's going bad. How to build something, not this. I do not have iron or a lake deep enough, but something that uses the ground instead of fighting it." Marit looked at Clara for a long time. This was the woman who had said a roof belongs above your head. This was the woman who had walked through a blizzard with her daughter's frostbitten hands pressed against her chest because the only thing she could see in the storm was an iron pipe rising from the ice. "Do you have a root cellar?" Marit asked. "Half dug. My husband started it before he left." "How deep?" 4 feet. Maybe 5 at the back. That is not deep enough for water insulation, but it is deep enough to hold ground temperature. 32 degrees in winter instead of 38 below. If you seal the walls, insulate the ceiling with sod, and run a vent pipe with a proper hood, you can shelter there during a storm. You will not be warm, but you will not die. Clara set the frozen milk jug on the ice. "Show me the vent," she said. Marit showed her. She demonstrated how to test draft with a candle flame held near the pipe base. If the flame bent toward the pipe, air was moving. If it stood straight, the pipe was blocked. She held the candle at different distances and showed Clara how the flame response changed. At 6 inches, a healthy draft made the flame lean at a sharp angle. At 12 inches, the lean was gentler. If you could not see a lean at 6 inches, the pipe was failing. She showed Clara how to check soot buildup on a lamp chimney as an early warning. Clean glass meant clean air. A brown film meant the vent was slowing. A black film meant the vent was nearly closed, and you had an hour, maybe 2, before the headache started. Do not wait for the headache, Marit said. By then, the air has been bad long enough to make your thinking slow. You will tell yourself you can fix it in the morning. You cannot. Fix it now, or open the door. She showed her the bell cord and the hatch lever and the drainage gutter. She explained the gutter twice because Clara could not understand why water on the walls was not dangerous. Marit dipped her hand in the condensation and held it up. Feel it, she said. It is not cold. It is the temperature of the room. The walls sweat because warm air meets cool iron. The water runs down, the gutter catches it, and it drips through to the dead space. Your bedding stays dry. Your floor stays dry. The water is not the enemy. Standing water with no drainage is the enemy. Clara asked questions for 2 hours. She copied diagrams onto the back of a feed bill with a piece of coal Marit sharpened with a knife. When she left, she took the frozen milk jug and left behind a jar of pickled beets and a sack of dried apples. Not payment. Exchange. Peter Solheim's brother arrived 2 days later. He was a quieter man than Peter had been, with a face that had aged 10 years in 2 nights. He asked whether a cellar could be built partly below the frost line using fieldstone and clay. Marit said she did not know, but Toliff might. She sent the brother to find Toliff. The schoolteacher, a woman named Gertrude Flatten, asked whether children could shelter in the lake room during storms that struck during school hours. The school was a 1/4 mile from the lake. The walk in a storm could kill. Marit said the room could hold 6 or 7 in an emergency, but the vent was sized for 4. More people meant more breath, which meant more demand on the draft. She would need a larger pipe or a second one. She drew the diagrams on flour sacks because she had no paper. She drew them in coal because she had no pencil. She spread the sacks on the ice and weighted the corners with stones and knelt beside anyone who came to look, pointing at lines and explaining joints and vents and anchors in words as plain as she could make them. She did not charge. She did not hoard the method. She did not make people prove they believed her before she helped them. She drew and explained and answered questions until her voice gave out, and then she drew some more. This mattered. Not because generosity is a virtue in stories, but because the innovation only works if it spreads. A method that lives in one person's head dies when that person dies. Marit understood this the way she understood water pressure, not as philosophy, but as physics. Knowledge that does not move is knowledge that freezes. Toliff came to the lake on the 4th day after the storm. He moved more slowly than before. The crawl across the ice during the blizzard had cost him. His cough had deepened into something that lived in his chest and did not leave, a wet, tearing sound that made Eli cover her ears. But he came. He and Marit stood inside the shelter and argued. The argument was about ventilation. 1 pipe is a throat, Toliff said. 2 pipes are lungs. 2 pipes means twice the heat loss, Marit said. The draft pulls warm air out. A 2nd pipe doubles the draw. A 2nd pipe lets you breathe if the first one fails. Last week you nearly died clearing a single vent. If you had been inside with both children and the pipe had frozen completely, the bell would have rung until the rope wore through. No one would have reached you. I would have opened the hatch. In a storm that killed Peter Solheim between his door and his barn. Marit said nothing. She looked at the vent pipe, which was drawing steadily now, the whistle soft and even. 1 pipe, 1 throat. 2 pipes, she said, but offset. 1 on the east side of the hatch, 1 on the west. Different hoods, different angles. If the wind packs 1, the other draws from the lee side. Toliff smiled. Now you are thinking like a cooper. I am thinking like someone who does not want to die. Same thing. They tested the 2-pipe design with smoke and candle flame. Toliff lit a rag inside the shelter and held it near each pipe in turn. The smoke divided, curling upward through both pipes, but more strongly through the one whose hood faced downwind. When Marit blocked one pipe with her hand, the other increased its draw to compensate. Not perfectly, but enough. Toliff sat on the platform after the test and coughed for 3 minutes without stopping. Marit sat beside him and waited. She did not offer water. She did not say he should rest. She had learned that these kindnesses embarrassed him more than the coughing did. When he stopped, he said, "My father made barrels in Stavanger. He could seal a joint by sound. He would tap the stave and know whether the hoop was tight before the barrel ever held liquid. I never learned that. I learned it secondhand from watching him, and then I learned it again from whiskey that leaked through bad work. Sound teaches, but failure teaches faster." He picked up the mallet. This was his. "I know. No. You know it was a mallet. You do not know it was his. He made it from a piece of ash that fell in a storm the year I was born. The head is not centered. It strikes 1/8 of an inch left of where you aim. You have to aim right to hit true." He handed it to Marit. She felt the weight, the off-center pull, the worn handle smoothed by 60 years of palms. "Learn the drift," he said. "Then it becomes yours." Marit tested the mallet against a rivet. It struck 1/8 left, just as he said. She adjusted. The second strike rang true. Toliff watched her correct without instruction, and nodded the way a man nods when he sees something he built working exactly as intended. The secondary crisis came 3 weeks after the blizzard. A sudden storm, smaller than the first, faster, meaner, struck during school hours on a Thursday. The schoolhouse stove, which had been cracked since November and repaired with clay that everyone knew would not hold, split along the firebox seam. Smoke poured into the single room. Gertrude Flotten opened both doors to clear it, and the wind drove snow across the desks and extinguished the stove entirely. 8 children sat in a freezing schoolhouse with no heat and a storm between them and home. Gertrude sent 2 older boys to Clara Mott's farm, which was closest. Clara's root cellar shelter was half finished. The walls were lined, the ceiling was partially sodded, and a vent pipe had been installed. But the vent cap had been put on backward by a well-meaning neighbor who had never seen one before. The cap faced into the wind instead of away from it. The wind drove snow and cold air down the pipe instead of drawing bad air up. Clara packed the 8 children and Gertrude into the cellar. Within 20 minutes, the air was thick with the breath of 10 people and the residual smoke from the stove that clung to the children's coats. Clara lit a lamp and the flame leaned away from the vent, the wrong direction. Air was coming in through the vent instead of going out. She sent a boy running to the lake. Marit received the message while repairing the east anchor line with a splice Toliff had taught her. The boy was 12, shaking, his lips blue. He said the cellar smelled wrong, and the teacher's eyes were red, and 2 of the younger children were coughing so hard they could not sit up. Toliff was at the lake. He heard the boy's report and stood up from the platform before Marit could speak. "The cap is backward," he said. "I will go." "Your lungs—" "The cap is backward. I know the fitting. I can turn it in 2 minutes." He was already walking. Marit grabbed the mallet, rope, and a spare vent hood and followed. The storm was not as severe as the blizzard that had nearly killed them all, but the wind was strong enough to blind, and the cold deep enough to threaten. Toliff moved fast for a man who could not breathe properly. He leaned into the wind as though leaning against a wall and kept his eyes on the ground, counting steps. They reached Clara's farm in 15 minutes. Toliff went straight to the vent pipe, which stuck up from the cellar roof at a slight angle. He could hear the wind howling down it. The cap was a simple cone of sheet iron fitted over the pipe mouth. designed to deflect wind and snow away from the opening. It was meant to be mounted so the open side faced downwind, creating a vacuum that drew air up and out. Mounted backward, it became a funnel that poured the storm into the cellar. Toliff climbed onto the cellar roof. The sod was slick with ice. He braced one foot against the vent pipe and reached for the cap. His fingers were stiff. The cap was held by a single bolt that had frozen into the fitting. He worked it with the wrench Marit handed up, his body shaking with each cough, the wind tearing at his coat. The bolt turned. The cap came free. He reversed it, aligned the open face downwind, and drove the bolt back in. The pipe made a sound, a sudden inhale, a gasp, as the draft reversed and began pulling foul air up and out of the cellar. From below, through the cellar door, Marit heard a child take a deep breath and start crying. Relief, not pain. Toliff climbed down from the roof. He stood in the lee of the cellar mound and coughed. This time the coughing did not stop after 3 minutes. It went on, bending him double, and when he finally straightened, the handkerchief was soaked through and his face was the color of old snow. "The children," he said. Marit went into the cellar. The air was already clearing, but the damage of 20 minutes of bad ventilation hung in the room like a fog. The lamp flame bent toward the vent now, proper draw. 2 of the younger children were lying on their sides on the dirt floor, their faces pale and their breathing shallow. Gertrude sat against the wall with her head between her knees. One boy had vomited into his hat. Marit checked each child. She made them breathe deeply and watched their chests. She counted pulses the way Belle had shown her during the blizzard, 2 fingers on the wrist, eyes on the watch. 2 of the younger ones had headaches that made them squint in the lamplight. One girl was trembling in a way that was not cold but fear. Gertrude was dizzy and her words came slowly, which was the carbon smoke still clearing from her blood. Clara was sitting in the corner with her fists clenched, furious at herself. Her face was rigid in the lamplight. She had done everything Marit taught her, lined the walls, sodded the ceiling, installed the pipe, and the one thing she had not checked was the one thing that mattered most. "I should have checked the cap," Clara said. "You did not know," Marit said. "I should have known. You showed me how draft works. I watched you test it with a candle, and I let a man who had never built a vent put the cap on backward because he offered, and I was too tired to watch." Marit knelt beside her. "Now you know. Next time you will check." Clara looked at the vent pipe, the lamp flame bending steadily toward it, the air moving the way it was supposed to move. "I thought you were hiding from winter," Clara said. "You were studying it." Toliff did not recover from the cold. The walk to Clara's farm, the climb onto the icy roof, the exposure while turning the cap, all of it settled into his lungs like water into a cracked barrel. The cough became constant. He could not walk the distance from town to the lake without stopping 3 times to lean against fence posts and wait for the spasm to pass. He came anyway. He came every day for a week, and each day he did less and watched more. He watched Marit teach a farmer how to lower a smaller barrel cellar without standing inside the rope triangle. She drew the danger zone with a stick in the snow and made the man step outside it before the rope went taut. He watched her correct someone's knot and did not speak, but Marit saw his face and knew what the silence meant. She no longer looked to him first. On the 6th day, he sat on an overturned crate beside the hatch and watched Marit inspect the east anchor line. She ran the rope through her hands, checking for frays the way he had taught her. She found a worn section 4 feet from the splice and held it up. "How bad?" she called. "Replace it," he said. "A fray that thin breaks under ice load. Not today. Next storm." "I can splice around it." "You can." But a splice in a worn line is a promise made by two weak things. Replace it. She replaced it. She cut the old line, measured the new one, tied the splice with the knot he had shown her the first week. He watched from the crate and did not correct her. There was nothing to correct. On the 8th day, he did not come. Marit found him in the room he rented behind the depot, lying on the cot with the blanket pulled to his chin. His breathing filled the room with a sound like paper tearing. The canvas tool roll sat on the floor beside the bed, already tied, as though he had packed it knowing someone would carry it for him. She brought him to the lake shelter, not because it could cure him, because it was warm, and the air was clean, and the walls held steady, and the vent drew sweet. She carried his tools in the canvas roll and hung them on the hooks beside the lamp. She set his chair, a crate with a folded blanket on top, beside the vent where the air was freshest. He lived 3 more days inside the iron room. Eli read to him from a school book. Bernd brought him water in a tin cup. Marit sat beside him in the evenings after the day's work, and they did not talk about seams or vents or anchors. They talked about Stavanger and about his father's workshop and about the sound a good barrel makes when you fill it for the first time. A deep note, he said, like a bell that has found its proper weight. He died on a Wednesday night, listening to the lake tap against the iron. He did not die with a speech. He was not that kind of man. He pressed the cooper's mallet into Marit's hand and said 4 words. Do not hurry the seam. The lake tapped the wall all night, patient as a clock with no face. By morning, the mallet lay on the plank beside Marit's hand, and the old man's chair was empty. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who understands that survival is often built long before the storm arrives. Marit buried Toliff Asen in the cemetery above the lake, in ground that took 4 men half a day to break open because the frost went down 3 feet. She stood at the grave with Eli and Bernd and Clara and Belle. Klein did not come. 8 others did, people Toliff had never met, but who were alive because of a vent pipe that drew properly, or a seam that held, or a knot that did not slip. She did not cry at the grave. She cried later, alone, inside the iron room where his cough had echoed and his mallet had rung against the rivet heads. She cried the way a person cries when the thing they have lost cannot be replaced by anything the world still contains. Then she picked up the mallet. She felt the off-center weight, aimed 1/8 to the right, and struck a rivet she had been meaning to check. It rang true. Klein moved fast after Toliff's death. He spread the story through the store. The old man had died because of the lake shelter, the damp, the cold walks, the exposure during the school crisis. All of it, Klein said, was evidence that the method was dangerous. He did not say Toliff had been sick before he met Marit. He did not mention that the school crisis was caused by a backward vent cap, not by the shelter design. He told the version that served him. First Solheim, Klein said. Now the old Cooper. How many dead before she admits it does not work? Bell heard this at the store and answered it publicly, as he had before. Solheim died in the open air between his house and his barn. The Cooper died of lungs that were failing before he ever saw the lake. The shelter did not kill either man. The storm killed Solheim. Sickness killed Asen. The shelter is the reason 8 children from the schoolhouse are alive to go home to their mothers. Klein did not reply. He did not need to. The fear was already planted. Some of the people who had come to the lake with questions stopped coming. The farmer who had been building a barrel cellar paused his work and covered the half-dug hole with boards. Gertrude Flatten asked Marit quietly whether the school children should still use the lake room as emergency shelter. She said the parents were asking, and 2 of them had used the word liable, which was Klein's word, not theirs. Marit said yes. She said it once, without argument, and went back to checking seams. She inspected every rivet on the east face of the shell that afternoon, marking each one with chalk, a circle for sound, a cross for suspect. She worked until the light failed, and then worked by lamplight until Eli came to the hatch and said Burnt was hungry. She had learned something from Toliff that she could not have named in words. It was not a technique, it was a way of answering doubt. You did not argue with the doubt. You did not perform confidence for the doubter's benefit. You checked the next seam. If the seam held, the seam answered. If it did not, you fixed it and checked again. The work was the argument. The numbers were the proof. Everything else was noise, and noise did not hold water. The town was splitting. Half of it had felt the shelter's warmth and believed the numbers. Half of it listened to Klein and believed the dead. Marit stood in the middle, holding a mallet that struck 1/8 to the left, teaching anyone who would listen and refusing to debate anyone who would not. She had become the person people came to, not because she asked them to, because the storm had answered every question except the ones Klein kept asking, and Klein's questions had no numbers behind them. Only names of the dead, arranged to sound like evidence. Winter did not end because the town wanted it to. It ended on its own schedule, which meant 6 more weeks of cold after Toliff's death, 6 more weeks of checking vents and marking seams and answering questions from people who came to the lake in 2s and 3s, their boots crunching on the ice, their faces carrying the particular expression of someone who has decided to believe something their neighbors have not. The work changed shape. Before the blizzard, Marit had been building a single structure to save 2 children. After the blizzard, she was maintaining a system that other people depended on, and the system demanded more than she had expected. The east anchor crib still needed resetting, the one that had shifted during the storm. The broken anchor line needed replacement, not just splicing, because the old rope had been weakened by the strain. The second vent pipe Toliff had helped install needed a permanent mounting bracket, not the temporary lashing she had rigged during the argument about 1 pipe versus 2. The interior platform boards were showing water stains where the gutter had overflowed during the storm, and 2 of them were soft at the grain. She worked alone now. That was the hardest part, not the labor itself, but the silence where Toliff's voice had been. She caught herself turning to ask him a question and finding empty air. She caught herself waiting for the tap of his mallet against the outside of the shell, the signal that he was checking the same seam from the other side. The silence was not dramatic. It was ordinary. That made it worse. Marit built the second shelter in February. Not for herself, for Clara. The root cellar behind Clara's farmhouse had proven its value during the schoolhouse crisis, despite the backward vent cap, and Clara wanted it finished properly. Marit spent 4 days there, lining the walls with fieldstone set in clay, extending the ceiling sod to full thickness, installing a 2-pipe ventilation system with offset hoods, and building a raised sleeping platform from salvaged barn boards. She taught Clara every step, not by doing it for her, but by standing beside her and naming what to look for. Press the stone until the clay rises between your fingers. If you see air behind the stone, pull it out and repack. Air pockets behind the wall are where the frost gets in. Clara worked with the focused intensity of a woman who had carried her daughter through a blizzard and did not intend to do so again. The third shelter was a community project, a storm cellar near the schoolhouse, dug by 4 men and lined by Marit and Clara together. It was smaller than the lake room, built into a hillside rather than submerged in water, but it used the same principles: sealed walls, proper ventilation with a hooded pipe, a raised platform, a drainage channel, a bell cord, and a lamp shelf with matches in a sealed jar. Gertrude Flatten kept the key. She checked the vent every Monday morning and marked the date on a slate inside the door. Marit insisted on one addition that no one else would have thought of. She hung a small mirror on the wall opposite the vent pipe, angled so that a person sitting on the platform could see the pipe opening without standing up. If snow packed the hood, the mirror would show frost creeping down the pipe interior before the draft failed. It was Toliff's principle turned into a tool. See the problem before you feel it. Listen before it breaks. The four men who dug the cellar were skeptical at the start. They had agreed to the work because the school teacher had asked them and because their children sat in that schoolhouse 5 days a week. But they dug in silence, and the silence had the quality of men waiting for someone to tell them this was foolish. Marit did not argue with the silence. She measured the walls, marked the level lines, and handed each man a specific task. You cut the stones, you mix the clay, you carry the sod, you set the pipe. By the third day, the silence had changed. They asked questions. By the fifth day, one of them asked Marit whether the same design would work for a cattle shelter, and she said she did not know, but the ventilation principles were the same for any enclosed space, and the man nodded and kept digging. By the end of February, the rhythm of Marit's days had changed. She was no longer building to survive. She was building to teach. The difference was not in the work itself. The seams still needed checking. The vents still needed clearing. The anchor lines still needed inspection, but in the direction it faced. Survival faces inward. Teaching faces out. She held a kind of school on the ice every Saturday afternoon, not a formal school. People came and watched and asked questions and left. She demonstrated how to test a vent with a candle, how to read soot on a lamp chimney, how to tie the 3 knots that mattered, the bowline for anchor lines, the clove hitch for temporary holds, and the double fisherman's for rope splicing. She showed them how to lower a barrel cellar with a tripod derrick, how to pack oakum with a blunt chisel at the right depth, how to mark seams with chalk so you did not waste time on work already done. Eli helped. The girl had learned more about ventilation and water pressure in 3 months than most adults would learn in a lifetime. She could test a vent draft by holding a thread near the pipe mouth and reading the angle. She could calculate air volume in a cylinder by measuring the diameter and height, and multiplying Bell had taught her the formula, and she had memorized it the way other children memorized hymns. She was 9 years old, and she could tell you how many hours of breathable air a sealed room contained, which was a strange thing for a child to know and a necessary one. Bernd was less interested in the numbers and more interested in the lake. He sat on the ice near the hatch and listened to the water tap against the iron. He said the tapping changed with the weather, faster before a storm, slower when the sky was clear. Marit did not know if this was true. She did not dismiss it. The thing about Rufus Klein was that he was not wrong about everything. He was wrong about Marit. He was wrong about the shelter. He was wrong about who had killed Toliff Aasen and Peter Solheim. But he was right that winter on the northern plains was dangerous. And he was right that not every structure built by amateurs would hold. And he was right that fear was a reasonable response to the idea of living under ice. His problem was not that he was afraid. His problem was that he used other people's fear to protect his own position. The crisis that broke him came in March, when a hard rain followed by a sudden freeze turned the town into a sheet of ice and then buried it in snow. Klein's store cellar, the underground room where he kept flour, sugar, dried goods, and the records that held half the county in debt, flooded when meltwater seeped through the foundation stones. Then the temperature dropped 30 degrees in 4 hours, and the water froze. Jars of preserves split. Flour sacks froze to the floor. The account ledger, which Klein kept in an iron box on a low shelf, survived, but the shelf above it collapsed and drove a broken jar through the lid. Worse than the cellar was the storeroom above it, where his niece was sleeping. Marte Klein was 13, visiting from Grand Forks because her mother had sent her to help with spring inventory. She had been sleeping in the back room on a cot near the stove. When the cellar flooded and the freeze hit, the floor temperature dropped, and the stove could not compensate. The chimney cap iced over. The same problem that had plagued half the buildings in town during every storm, and smoke backed into the room. Marte developed a lung fever overnight. Her cough was deep and wet, the kind Belle recognized immediately. She needed steady warmth, clean air, and rest. The storeroom had none of these things. The floor was cold, the air was fouled, and the stove alternated between smoking and going out. Belle told Klein the girl needed to be moved. "Where?" Klein asked. Belle did not answer. He did not need to. They both knew that there was only one place in Devil's Lake that could hold a sick child in steady warmth with clean air that did not depend on a chimney drawing properly in a freeze. Klein arrived at the lake hatch at dusk. He was not wearing his store coat. He was wearing a field jacket that made him look smaller and older. He carried Marte in his arms, the girl wrapped in 2 blankets with her face pressed against his chest. He did not have his public voice. He did not have his performance. He had a sick child and nowhere else to go. Marit was inside the shelter, checking the vent draw before nightfall. She heard the hatch open and looked up to see Klein standing on the ladder, his boots on the 3rd rung, his niece held against him, his face carrying an expression she had never seen on it before. It was the face of a man who was about to ask for something from someone he had tried to destroy. "Belle says she needs warmth," Klein said. "Steady warmth, clean air." Marit looked at the girl. Marte's eyes were closed. Her breathing was audible, the rattling, labored sound of lungs fighting fluid. Her lips were dry. "Bring her down," Marit said. Klein descended the ladder and laid Marte on the sleeping platform. Marit adjusted the blankets, set a jar of water within reach, and moved the lamp closer so Belle, who came down after Klein, could examine the girl in decent light. The shelter was 64 degrees. The vent drew evenly through both pipes. The walls tapped with the lake's steady rhythm. Marte's breathing eased within the first hour, not because the warmth cured the lung fever, but because the stable temperature and clean draft let her body stop fighting the air and start fighting the infection. Klein stood in the corner of the iron room and looked at what he had mocked: the lamp hanging from a rivet hook, the chalk marks on the seams, the vent pipes running through their wooden sleeves, the sleeping shelf with its dry blankets, Eli's school slates stacked beside the wall, their surfaces covered in arithmetic and diagrams, Burnt's tin cup on the shelf beside Toliff's canvas tool roll. He was inside the coffin he had named, and the coffin was warmer than his store, safer than his cellar, and quieter than anything he had built above ground. "I said coffin," Klein said. His voice was flat, not defiant, not apologetic. The voice of a man stating a fact he could no longer maintain. "You said many things," Marit replied. She did not say more. She did not need to. The iron walls said it. The vent said it. The 64 degrees said it. The girl breathing easier on the platform said it. Every number Belle had written on the flour sack, and every seam Toliff had sealed, and every candle flame that bent toward the pipe said it, and none of them needed Marit to translate. Marte recovered over 3 days. Belle checked her twice daily, climbing down the hatch ladder with his medical bag and climbing out with his mustache frozen and his notes growing longer. On the 2nd day, Marit changed the girl's blankets and propped her up against the iron wall so she could breathe more easily. The wall was warm to the touch, not hot, not even what most people would call warm, but warm compared to every other wall in Devil's Lake that week. Marty pressed her palm flat against it and left it there. "It feels like it is alive," she said. "It is the lake," Marit said. "The lake holds the temperature. The iron carries it through." On the 3rd morning, the girl opened her eyes and asked for food, and Clara, who had brought soup, fed her from a tin bowl while Klein sat on a crate and watched. He did not speak during the feeding. He watched Clara's hands, which were steady and practiced, and he watched the lamp flame, which did not flicker, and he watched the vent pipe, which whistled softly, and he saw the system working the way Marit had always said it would, not through force, not through fuel, but through the patient, steady physics of water that refused to panic. When they brought Marte out into the daylight, Klein stood on the ice for a long time without speaking. Then he walked to the store and opened the account book and wrote a figure beside Marit's name. Not a debt, a credit. He paid for pipe and rope and iron strapping sufficient to build 3 public storm shelters, one near the school, one near the church, and one near the lake road where travelers sometimes got caught in storms between towns. But Marit made Bell hold the account book. Not Klein. She was not going to let the man who had tried to destroy her name the work after himself. So Knut Brecke arrived in Devil's Lake in April when the ice was beginning to crack and the lake was showing dark water along the shoreline. He was 39, a widowed blacksmith and rail repairman who had come west from Fargo looking for steady work after the railroad cut his repair crew. He had forearms like fence posts, a quiet manner, and the habit of looking at a broken thing for a long time before touching it. He heard about the lake shelter from the depot operator, who told the story the way depot operators tell stories, with exact distances, exact temperatures, and no emotional embellishment whatsoever. Knut walked to the lake and stood beside the hatch, and looked at the vent pipes and the anchor lines and the bell cord, and said nothing for 10 minutes. Then he knelt beside the hatch frame and ran his thumb along the iron edge where Toliff had cut the opening with a cold chisel. "This edge is rough," he said to no one in particular. "The hatch cover does not seat properly. You're losing heat through a gap the width of a pencil." Marit was standing behind him. She had come to check the afternoon vent draw and found a stranger inspecting her work. "I know about the gap," she said. "You need a collar, an angle iron frame welded to the shell, with a gasket of tarred rope between the frame and the cover. The cover drops into the collar and seals on its own weight. I do not have a welder. I have a forge." He stood up. "I also have no work and no money and a room at the boarding house that expires on Friday." Marit studied him. She had learned to be careful around men who arrived with tools and opinions. Every one of them, from Klein to the well-meaning neighbor who had installed Clara's vent cap backward, had assumed they understood her work better than she did. Some of them had been right about small things. None of them had been right about the principle. "If you build the collar," she said, "you build it to my measurements, not yours." "Your measurements suit me," Knut said. "I do not know water. I know iron." He built the collar in 2 days. He carried the angle iron pieces from a scrap pile at the depot, heated them in a portable forge he set up on the lake shore, and bent them to match the hatch opening. He welded the joints with a brazing rod and filed the rough edges smooth. He fitted a tarred rope gasket into the collar channel and set the hatch cover into place. The cover dropped into the collar with a sound like a book closing, clean, tight, no gap. Marit tested the seal by lighting a candle inside and watching for flame movement near the hatch edge. Nothing. The only air entering the shelter came through the designated intake gaps below the collar, which fed the ventilation circuit exactly as designed. "The gasket will compress over time," Knut said. "Replace the rope every autumn before the first freeze. Tar it fresh. If you feel a draft at the hatch that was not there before, the gasket has flattened." He gave the instruction in the same tone Toliff had used, not explaining to someone who did not understand, but noting a detail to someone who would know when it mattered. Marit heard the tone and recognized it. This was a man who respected the work before he respected the person doing it, and the respect for the person followed from the work, not the other way around. Knut built vent collars for the 2 new public shelters. He fabricated hatch hinges from salvaged rail hardware that swung smoothly and locked from inside. He made a set of inspection tools, a small mirror on a handle for checking pipe interiors, a wire brush size to the vent diameter, a scraper for ice at pipe rims, and gave them to Marit in a canvas roll that he had sewn himself because Toliff's roll was full. Their partnership formed through labor. He made what she designed. She tested what he made. When his collar did not seat properly on Clara's shelter hatch, Marit told him the opening was 3/8 of an inch wider on the east side, and he refabricated without complaint. When her drainage gutter design overflowed during a spring thaw, he suggested a wider channel with a screen to catch debris, and she adopted the change without defensiveness. The truss came slowly and through a specific test. In May, the ice began to break up, and the submerged shelter needed its annual inspection. The anchor lines checked, the lower seams examined from inside, the platform boards tested for rot, where the drainage channel kept them damp. Knut offered to do the inspection. Marit said no. She said she would do it herself, as she always had, because she knew the sounds, and he did not. Knut asked to come with her, not to do the work, to learn the sounds. They descended together. Marit tapped the rivets one by one, while Knut pressed his ear to the wall from the outside, lying flat on the ice the way Toliff had done the first day the shell went down. Marit struck a rivet with the mallet and waited. Knut tapped back twice, his signal that the sound was clear. She moved to the next. At the 14th rivet, she struck and heard a faint buzz, a vibration that lingered half a second longer than it should. She marked it with chalk. From outside, Knut tapped once. He had heard it too. When she climbed out, he was already examining the seam from the exterior. "The tar has cracked at the lower edge," he said. "I can feel the ridge with my thumb. It needs repacking." "Oakum first," Marit said. "Then tar. Then a strap if the crack runs deeper than the surface." "I know," he said, and then more quietly, "Toliff taught you well." "He taught me to listen. The rest I taught myself." Knut nodded. He did not try to claim knowledge he did not have, and he did not minimize what she had earned. This was the moment Marit decided she could work beside him for longer than a season. They did not court in the way the town expected, no Sunday visits, no formal calls, no conversation about anything except iron and rope and vent angles and the proper depth for oakum packing. The town noticed anyway. Clara said Marit had found a man who could take instruction, which was rarer than a warm cellar. Bell said nothing, but he added Knut's name to the inspection schedule beside Marit's. They married the following autumn, after the first vent inspection of the season, in a ceremony that Bell witnessed and Clara attended with all 5 of her children and Nell, whose fingers worked perfectly, and who carried a small bouquet of late wildflowers she had picked beside the lake. Eli stood beside her mother and held the mallet during the vows because there was no ring yet, and the mallet was the closest thing to an inheritance Marit owned. Bernd stood beside Knut and looked at the lake the way he always looked at the lake, as though it were telling him something only he could hear. The years compressed the way years do when the crisis has passed and the work continues without the drama that made the work visible. Marit and Knut built a proper house above ground beside the lake, timber-framed, tight-roofed, with a cellar that used the ventilation principles she had developed, and a stove that drew properly because Knut had fabricated the chimney cap himself. The submerged shelter remained. In winter, it served as emergency housing. In summer, Marit used it to keep milk and butter cool, the lake water holding 39 degrees as faithfully in July as it had in January. The iron walls never warmed. The iron walls never froze. The lake did not care about the calendar. There were moments that marked the years. The first time a stranger arrived from a settlement 40 miles west, carrying a letter from Bell with a diagram on it, asking to see the shelter with his own eyes. The evening Marit sat on the ice and realized she had not thought about the county poor officer in a year. The morning Knut woke her to say the lake had frozen early and the vent pipes were already wearing their first caps of frost, and she felt not fear but readiness. The difference between a person who dreads winter and a person who has learned to answer it. The winter of 1914 brought a storm nearly as severe as the one that had tested the shelter for the first time. Marit and Canute sheltered 14 people in the lake room and Clara's cellar combined, 7 in each, rotating through in shifts because the air supply could not support all 14 at once. They ran the shifts by the clock, 4 hours in, 2 hours out in the above-ground house where the stove burned and the chimney drew and the walls held against everything except the worst gusts. No one died. No one lost fingers. The iron held. After that storm, Bell wrote a summary of the shelter system for a medical journal in Fargo. He described the physics in terms a doctor would understand, the constant temperature of deep water, the thermal mass of the lake acting as a heat reservoir, the ventilation requirements for confined spaces. He included Marit's measurements from every storm she had recorded. He credited her by name. The journal published it in the spring of 1915, and Marit found out about it when a copy arrived in the mail with Bell's handwriting on the envelope and a note that read, "The numbers speak for themselves. I thought they should speak louder." Eli grew into a sharp, quiet young woman who could calculate air volume in her head and read a vent draft by the sound of the pipe. She became a telegraph operator at the depot, which suited her. She liked systems that worked on precise signals, and she liked the feeling of information moving through wire the way air moved through a pipe, visible only by its effects. Burnt apprenticed as a machinist in Fargo, which suited him differently. He liked touching metal and making it do things it had not done before, which was his mother's gift translated into a different material. Marit never patented the method. She had seen what paper could do in the hands of men like Klein. A filing defect had taken her husband's land and nearly taken her children. She distrusted documents that gave ownership of knowledge to anyone with a stamp and a fee. Instead, she let Bell copy her diagrams for nearby settlements. Bell's careful medical hand turned flour sack drawings into clear plans that traveled by mail to homesteads and small towns across the northern plains. He noted the measurements, the principles, the ventilation requirements, and the inspection schedule. He did not put his name on them. He put Marit's. By the third winter after the blizzard, 7 families in the Devil's Lake area knew how to build some version of the shelter. Not all of them were submerged iron rooms. Most were earth-sheltered cellars, root cellars with proper ventilation, or bank dugouts reinforced with stone and sod. The exact method changed with money, land, and available materials. The principle did not. Keep the earth or water between you and the wind, seal the walls, vent the air, check the draft, mark the seams. The town learned to ask different questions, not how much fire can we make, but where does the heat go? Not how thick is the wall, Pincheron, but what is touching the wall? Not who thought of it, but has the vent been cleared? Clara taught women from neighboring farms how to inspect draft and seams. She carried a candle and a piece of chalk in her coat pocket all winter, the way other women carried handkerchiefs. She became the person you sent for when a vent sounded wrong because she had learned to hear the difference between a healthy whistle and a choking one, and she had learned it from a woman who had learned it from a cooper who had learned it from a whiskey leaking through bad work. Klein sold pipe and rope and vent hoods from his store. He charged fair prices for them, which was the closest he ever came to an apology. He never said Marit's name with admiration. He said it with the careful neutrality of a man who has been proven wrong in public and has decided that silence is cheaper than acknowledgement. But the pipe he sold was good pipe, and the rope was sound, and when a customer asked how to install a vent cap, Klein told them to go see the Vangian woman at the lake. Marit aged beside the water. She kept Toliff's cooper's mallet hanging on a hook near the hatch, and every autumn before the first hard freeze, she carried it down the ladder and tapped every rivet in the shell. She listened for the flat sound that meant a seam was loosening. She listened for the click that meant a rivet was turning under pressure. She listened for the hollow slap of water against unsupported iron. Most years, she heard nothing wrong. The years she did hear something, she fixed it before the ice came, and the shell held another season. When she was old enough that climbing the ladder hurt her knees, Canute built a set of wooden steps with a handrail that descended through the hatch at a gentler angle. She used the steps and carried the mallet and tapped the rivets and listened. The lake still tapped back, patient as it had been the first night she heard it, lying on the platform with her children beside her and the blizzard screaming above. She died in 1932 in the above-ground house Canute had built beside the lake, in a bed with a proper mattress and a window that looked out over the ice. She was 56. The lung fever that took her was not the same illness that had taken Toliff, but it lived in the same place. The chest, the breath, the place where air met body and one of them gave way. Knut sat beside her. Eli came from the depot. Bernd came from Fargo on the morning train. The mallet lay on the bedside table. She had asked for it the day before, not to use it, but to hold it. The off-center weight sat in her palm the way it had sat in Toliff's and in his father's before him. Her children kept the vent pipe standing long after the submerged chamber was no longer used for shelter. They sealed the hatch and left the pipe as a marker, black iron rising through white ice every winter, a small hood turned away from the wind, and beneath it the sound of water touching metal that no one could hear unless they pressed their ear to the ice and listened. Years earlier, Rufus Klein had stood beside the store stove and told the men gathered there that Widow Vangen had finally found a house cheap enough, one that sinks. He was right about only one thing. It did sink. It sank below the wind, below the snow, below the killing speed of air moving across open prairie with nothing between it and the horizon. It sank into the one place the blizzard could touch but could not command. Above it, cabins cracked, chimneys froze. Men lost their way between barn and door. Peter Solheim died reaching for a handle he could see. Below it, a lamp burned against iron, children breathed, and water pressed its steady 39-degree hand against the walls. Marit Vangen built a house that sank, and the lake held it the way her father's barrels held water, by keeping the leaks sealed and the air from carrying away what mattered. The last image is the vent pipe, black iron rising through white ice, a small hood turned away from the wind, the quiet sound of water touching metal beneath it, patient and steady, the sound of something that was called a coffin and became a chimney,